Hey guys, Jay here. Welcome to Eons of Battle. I've been playing around with pigments for a while now and have quickly fallen in love. In this video, I want to get to the bottom of store-bought versus homemade and what varnish, if any, should I be using.
And stay tuned to the end of the video to see the EOB Complete Viewer Minis.
Pigments are one of those things war painters upgrade to. It's not something you start with. Pigments require a certain finesse. Eventually, you reach a point in your hobby career where you see pigments being used on pro models and you want to try your hand at it. How hard can it be? Well, it's kinda hard. Like any new tool, it has a learning curve, and pigments are very open-ended. You can apply them dry or wet, mix them with alcohol, water, or a medium, and then comes the issue of, do you varnish or not? So what are pigments? Well, pigments are natural and synthetic finely ground particles that are water soluble. They give a dry look and are often used to portray rust, sand, or dust on a model and are typically the final step. Dry pigments don't work well on edges or very smooth surfaces, and a little bit of grit or even a matte varnish will help them adhere to the model. And adhere is a good word. There's a misconception that dry pigments will just fall off over time, but that's not really true. A dry pigment layer is just a little more delicate than a normal paint layer. I've been using pigments from Vallejo and Secret Weapon for a while now, and when they show up in videos, I always get comments saying that crushed up pastels are just as good and way cheaper. So I went ahead and picked some up, and I'll be trying those out as well. These are chalk pastels, not to be confused with oil pastels. These will not powder or perform like dry pigments. I need to turn these pastels into powder, and I don't want to shave off some each time I have to use them. I found the pastels that were the closest match to my Secret Weapon pigments. Neither orange that came with the set were a great match, but this dark red is perfect. I took my pastels and put them into a bag. I placed it in a towel and then began to tap it gently with a hammer. This worked nicely, and checking regularly to make sure I wasn't putting a big hole in the bag, I had some nice homemade pigments. So I now have my pigments, both product and homemade. It's time to start this project. For this experiment, I want to create a rust effect, and I'll be using my pigment product from Secret Weapon and my crushed up pastels. For my test piece, it's going to be using this lovely ruined wall from the Necromunda Barricades and Objectives box. This set is perfect because there's 2 identical pairs in each box. I have selected 8 pieces of terrain and have already painted and matte coated them, so they are ready for the experiment. On the first test,
How did you paint those?
Well, that's not really what this video is about. See,
How did you paint those?
Okay, I'll tell you, just really fast. The first thing I did was I applied some Games Workshop Technical Agrellant Earth Crackle Paint to certain areas of the models and allowed that a few hours to dry. Then I painted on my custom blend for texture paste, spackle or polyfilla, Elmer's white glue, fine grained sand, and black ink. This and the crackle medium adds some much needed texture, which is good. Pigments are almost the opposite of washes, in that instead of nice clean smooth shapes, the pigments need a little bit of grit and texture, so this step should give the powders the best possible chance of success. I stippled this all over the model and then allowed it to dry. Then I primed the model black with my favorite airbrush primer, Stynel Res Black. But you could also do this with a rattle can. Then I airbrushed on a model coat of Vallejo Game Color Gory Red and Vallejo Model Color Bright Orange to make it look like rusty metal. After that, I gave the piece the first of many varnish coats to protect the paint. This one was satin. Then I hosed down the model with some Vallejo chipping medium. With that applied, I carefully sprayed on some Vallejo Bone White in the large panels. Then I used some water, a makeup sponge, and a toothpick to chip away the bone whites. When I was happy with my chipping, I gave the model a matte coat varnish. Then I broke out the oil paints. I airbrushed on some oil paint Burnt Umber and removed it from the bone white panels with a makeup sponge. Then I went in with black oil wash and highlighted the rivets. Then I added more mineral spirits to the mixture and gave the rest of the metal a wash. This might seem like a huge amount of work, but it's just a lot of small steps, and as you add models, you don't add a lot more working time. All 8 of these I finished in about 2 hours, and I'm faster now that I have the experience.
And nothing helps us get more experience like the help of our lovely Patreon supporters. We make wargaming and modeling videos at breakneck speeds, and if you want to support us making more, the best way to do so is over on Patreon. And you'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, voting on what we paint live on YouTube, extra live streams every week, and more. And with that out of the way, Jay has an experiment to run.
So I have my barricades and pigments, it's time to start painting. Or pigmenting. Let's start the experiment. So on the first pair of barricades, I gave them a dousing with pigments and learned quickly that less is more. It covered up a lot of my details, but it sure is vibrant. To apply the pigment, I brushed it on like normal paint, but I also pressed it into the model with a pushing motion, so make sure you use a brush that you don't care about. Then I tried to match the work I did with the pigment products using the crushed up pastels. These worked, but they were very light compared to the product, because they were not quite as finely powdered, but I still achieved a very similar result. On the second pair, I tried to use a little less pigment and I found that the product really goes on smoothly, almost too smoothly. I matched it with the pastels and found that I needed to do more passes, but it did give me more control. I'm learning, and it looks pretty darn close in the end. On to the third pair, I used even less pigments and tried to make some nice streaks and spots of rust, and the product really helped me here because it's so consistent and controllable. The pastels were also very nice, but I did need to do a little extra powdering in the bag because the hammer didn't pulverize them perfectly. But so far, they're just as good. And finally, the last set, on these I applied less pigment still and was feeling much better about my ability to get pigment where I wanted it, and only where I wanted it. With the pastels, they were very close, but did not have the exact same brush feel as the product, and were a little more clumpy and not as smooth. But the difference is barely noticeable. Then I went in with some water on my brush to do a little cleanup work. The pigments soak up the water fast, and this let me wipe away any pigment that was too smooth. I did the same water trick on all the pastels, and this helped me make the rust look a lot more natural and less like I just rubbed Cheeto dust on everything. With the pigments applied, it's now time to see how the varnishes will affect the powders. The first trial of the varnishes I did was a classic, wet coat of gloss varnish and then a wet coat of matte varnish. A lot of gamers use this combination because it really does make an indestructible layer between greasy Cheeto fingers and the model. For the second pair, I tried the alcohol approach, dipping some isopropyl onto the pigments to get them set. The dry pigments and capillary action help the alcohol flow over the model, and hopefully, hydrating all the pigments will make them bond permanently. On the next set, I did a very light spray of some matte varnish, leaving about 7 inches between the airbrush and the model. I'm hoping that a light dusting will be enough to hold the pigments. And lastly, my wild card, some Krylon workable fixative. Now this isn't meant for models, but it is the thing for artists to stick down charcoal and pastels, so why wouldn't it work on models? I gave each of the sides a squirt to see what would happen. I let those varnishes sit overnight, and then I gave each piece a rub with a cotton swab to see if any pigments wanted to come off. On the first pair, the gloss coat matte coat combo, obviously there was no possible way any pigment would come loose. The cotton swab didn't pick up anything, and scraping it with the wood part did no damage either. This did change the colors the most. They're still there, but they're much darker, and the red seems to have overpowered the orange pigments. I wouldn't suggest this varnish if you want to use pigments. The alcohol method did 2 things. It did bind down the pigments, but it also pushed them around a little. They still have a very nice dry look and are nicely attached to the model, but it did change the colors a little as well. This is a very good method though if you need the pigments to stay completely dry looking. The next pair, I did the very light matte varnish, and this was my favorite. The colors did darken a little bit, but it's barely noticeable. No pigments wanted to come off, and they are all safely stuck to the model. The workable fixative, which is the one I had no idea what it was going to do, I was pleasantly surprised. The colors did darken a little bit more than the matte, but not nearly as much as the matte coat gloss coat, and you can still see the grain and buildup of the pigments while being a nice strong varnish. I don't know if I'll use this on models, but for vehicles and terrain, I'll definitely be using it. So with the experiment over, it's time for my final thoughts. I think pigments are an awesome tool and can give you some very unique and interesting results simply and efficiently. The differences I saw between the pastels and the products were almost unnoticeable, but I do think the products still win in my book because of how consistent they were. The products have been professionally pulverized, and every brush load felt exactly the same. The pastels were the same color-wise, but since I crushed them myself, the size of the powders and nuggets were a bit random. But there is something to be said for getting 24 different colors for a little over $15. For varnishes, I wouldn't suggest varnishing at all unless you really plan on roughhousing with your minis. The pigments really shouldn't fall off from normal use, but if you need something in between, I would suggest the light dusting of matte varnish to seal your pigments. But the Krylon Workable Fixative was a surprise success, and it was super easy and worked great. The dryness Pigments offer will never look its best with something on top of it. Well, I definitely know more now than when I started. What do you guys think? Do pigments seem worth it, or is it a whole lot of hassle for not a lot of results? I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching. And now, it's time for EOB Completes. We put out a challenge to our community to give us photos of their recently finished models to be immortalized in the video. If you want to join in on the fun, you can submit a before and after photo of your painted mini to our Discord server, which you can find in the description below, or you can post it to Instagram with the hashtag EOBCompletes. This week, I painted up this Plague Marine. Let's look at and get inspired by what other folks have finished this week. We have a Space Marine Chaplain by Kubizan, a Chaotic Chaplain by the user RedCamp144, some Custodes Terminators from Zwappy, a Glowy Sister of Battle from Pharaoh von Serfio, a Custom Nightlord by Bio, some Space Marines by Xander Rose, a Great Imperial Regiment by Just Make Stuff, a crazy number of orcs from Urlak Uruk, a squad of Necron Warriors from Sky Shroud Ants, Age of Sigmar Boner Boy terrain from Freddy Pooh, a Necron Scorpek Lord by Filthy, a Cabalite Dark Eldar from Alder Hill Miniature Painting, a fun diorama from Davy Boy 666, a Necron Warrior by Dean's Mini Painting, and a Death Dread from Ultra 40K. Congratulations to everyone for getting stuff done, and keep sending us more minis. Let's keep this snowball rolling. Good night.